In the year 1347, a shadow, unlike any other, crept silently across the seas and slipped into the crowded ports of Europe. At first, it was barely noticed, a strange sickness spreading quietly among sailors and merchants. But soon, that faint murmur of illness grew into a deafening roar of despair that no one could escape. The cities, once bursting with life, markets buzzing with trade, and streets alive with laughter, grew still. In Messina, Marseille, and later Venice, the first victims fell ill with terrifying speed. A sudden fever gripped them, their skin breaking out in painful swollen lumps called buboes, dark, bruised, and oozing, signaling the beginning of a swift and merciless death. There was no warning, no cure, no escape. From the highest throne to the humblest cottage, the plague showed no mercy. Kings in their gilded halls, merchants in their busy shops, mothers tending their children, and children clinging to their mothers, all were caught in the invisible web of death. Entire families vanished overnight, swallowed by the unrelenting darkness. In Florence, the city of art and commerce, death carts creaked through the cobblestone streets, day and night. The carts were piled high with bodies, young and old, rich and poor, carried to mass graves dug hastily on the outskirts of town. Priests hurried from home to home, offering last rites, but many fell ill themselves and died, their prayers silenced forever. The air grew heavy with a sickening stench, rotting flesh mingling with the dust of abandoned homes and the cries of the desperate. Neighbors locked their doors and refused to care for the sick. Fear twisted hearts. Suspicion and sorrow bred cruelty. In some villages, people fled en masse, leaving behind empty homes and fields untilled, as if the land itself mourned. Doctors appeared in strange costumes, their faces hidden behind bird-like masks, stuffed with aromatic herbs, hoping to ward off the unseen killer. Their remedies were grim, bleeding, purging, burning incense, but none could halt the plague's march. Many healers themselves became victims, their knowledge powerless against the horror. As the months turned to years, the plague swept like a storm across Europe, from the frozen fjords of Scandinavia to the sunlit shores of Spain. It tore through armies, disrupted trade, and shattered governments. Scholars estimate that between 1/3 and half of Europe's population was lost, more than 20 million souls swallowed by the darkness. This devastation left scars beyond the loss of life. Fields lay barren, markets closed, and feudal lords struggled to find laborers for their lands. The social order, once rigid and unyielding, began to crumble as survivors demanded wages and rights. The old world was dying, and a new one, born of pain and upheaval, would soon rise. Yet amid the horror, human courage and resilience endured. Survivors clung to hope, rebuilt shattered communities, and sought meaning in a world forever changed. Artists painted the dance of death, writers chronicled the nightmare, and faith gave solace to the grieving. This is the story of the Black Death, a tale of unimaginable suffering, profound loss, and the indomitable spirit of humanity. It is a story that echoes through the centuries, reminding us of both our fragility and our strength in the face of catastrophe. The winds blew hot and dusty across the Silk Road, the ancient artery that stretched from the markets of China to the ports of the Mediterranean. In the year 1346, the world had not yet glimpsed the horror to come, but the signs were there, hidden in the flickering fires of caravans, in the soft scratching of flea-bitten fur, in the silence that fell over towns, far from the gaze of Europe. It began, as great tragedies often do, in a place few in the West had ever heard of. The city of Kaffa, a Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula, sat as a hinge between East and West. It was a melting pot of goods, faiths, languages, and soon disease. Merchants traded silk and spices by the cartload. Genoese sailors filled their hulls with grain and cloth. But outside the city walls, the Mongol armies of the Golden Horde were laying siege. The Mongols had come with vengeance in their hearts, driven by politics, by tribal grievances, and by greed. But even they did not understand the deeper enemy they carried in their ranks, an invisible killer clinging to their rats, living in their fleas, riding on the backs of wagons, and crawling into tents by night. The sickness struck the Mongol camp first. Men who had ridden across half the world fell screaming in their yurts, vomiting black blood, their skins swelling into grotesque lumps, buboes, dark as bruised plums. Their eyes rolled back in their skulls. Within days, the stench of death rolled over the siege lines like a second army. As the Mongol soldiers dropped dead by the thousands, their commanders made a decision, both brutal and legendary. They loaded the corpses of the infected onto catapults and hurled them over Kaffa's walls. What had begun as a siege became the world's first recorded act of biological warfare. Inside Kaffa, horror reigned. The Genoese and Venetian merchants, who had once counted their gold by the weight, now counted their dead. The disease, already airborne in the hot summer wind, spread through the crowded alleys and into the merchant ships docked in the port. The wealthy tried to flee. The poor buried their children in mass graves and waited for the fever to take them. Among the Genoese ships that fled Kaffa, a few sailed west, toward Sicily, toward Genoa, toward Europe. Aboard one such ship was Alessandro Di Martino, a spice trader's son from Palermo. He had left home 2 years prior, hoping to carve his fortune in the East. He returned emaciated, hollow-eyed, and coughing blood. He would never set foot on land again. The ship drifted into Messina's harbor like a ghost, its sails tattered, its hull silent. The dock workers approached with caution, expecting commerce, but finding death. The few men who disembarked were sick, delirious, muttering prayers, covered in boils. They collapsed on the docks. Some died that same night. Others walked into the town and brought the Black Death with them. Within days, Messina became a city of funeral bells. Bodies were stacked in alleyways. Priests wept at their altars, and the governor, frantic and helpless, ordered the infected ships out of the port. But it was too late. The plague had slipped from the ships like smoke, invisible and hungry, and taken root in the streets, the bakeries, the churches, and the bedrooms of the city. Word of the sickness spread quickly, but so did fear and lies. Some claimed it was a punishment from God. Others whispered that it was a miasma, a corruption in the air brought by the winds from China or the wrath of the stars. Physicians scrawled diagrams and prayed to the heavens, fumbling with leeches and herbs while their apprentices dropped dead beside them. In Palermo, Alessandro's family heard the news. His father Giovanni refused to believe it. He sat each day by the docks, staring out at the sea, expecting his son's return. But when the ship came, it did not carry Alessandro. Only a letter, sealed in wax, delivered by a trembling sailor who dropped it and fled. The letter was stained, half illegible, but its words were enough. Father, do not wait. Turn from the sea. There is no safety there. Do not open your doors to strangers. Burn my letters. The fever takes the soul before it takes the body. By the winter of 1347, Sicily was lost. Thousands lay dead, and those who survived fled north, to Naples, to Rome, to Florence, bringing with them the seeds of catastrophe. In Constantinople, the great capital of Byzantium, the plague followed in merchant wagons and across trade routes that had flourished for centuries. The city's churches filled with the sick. Priests died as fast as they could deliver last rites. The emperor's own advisors fell ill. The palace, for all its marble and gold, could not protect anyone from what the locals began calling the Great Mortality. From Constantinople, it moved faster than anyone could imagine. Across the Balkans, into the Adriatic ports, up the Dalmatian coast, and from there into Italy, France, and Spain. But the disease didn't only ride with traders. It traveled with silence, with rats in grain sacks, with the fleas nesting in bed straw. It did not discriminate. It killed rich and poor alike. The Pope would eventually hole up in a room surrounded by fires, hoping to purify the air. Kings would abandon their courts. Priests would abandon their parishes. The world was about to change forever. The people of Europe, living in cities and villages, still clinging to the last vestiges of feudalism and faith, had no idea what was coming. Their fields were full, their granaries stocked, their cathedrals filled with song. They did not know that within months their streets would run black with bodies. And far away in the east, in towns whose names would never be remembered, the plague still lingered, still waiting, still killing. It would follow the roads west, always west, toward the heart of Europe, toward its cities and villages, toward its kings and children and graveyards. It had begun. Winter arrived in Italy with its usual chill, but there was something strange in the air, a quiet dread that settled in villages like a fog before dawn. In the south, the cities of Sicily had already begun to rot. No one knew how many had died in Messina or Palermo. Bodies were burned or buried in mass pits too quickly to count. The churchyards overflowed, and the priests stopped ringing the funeral bells because they never had time to stop. Yet even as ships carried news of sickness and death northward, many dismissed it as rumor or distant misfortune. People had always died of fever after all. The world was no stranger to illness, and so, when vessels bearing grain and silks arrived in Naples, Genoa, and Pisa, they were received with the same old hunger for trade, for gold, for contact with the greater world. And with them came death. It started quietly in Genoa. A dock worker collapsed beside a wine barrel. A merchant's son fell ill during Mass. Then more followed, first a dozen, then hundreds. Swollen lymph nodes, purple and black, rose under the arms and groin. Fever burned the body until the mind cracked. Blood seeped from noses, from ears, from open wounds that no one could explain. The smell, sickly sweet and foul, clung to the cobblestone streets. In Florence, where artists, bankers, and scholars mingled in a city already bursting with wealth and ambition, the sickness moved with terrifying speed. It arrived in the spring of 1348, when the flowers were blooming and the markets were alive. But in mere weeks, the streets became graveyards. Among the first to fall was Tommaso Ricci, a baker known across his district for his generous spirit and perfect loaves. When his daughter Bianca grew ill, he thought it was the spring fever. He brought her warm broth, recited psalms beside her bed, kissed her brow. 2 days later she was dead, her skin covered in black spots. The next day, his wife collapsed. Then Tommaso himself, alone in the house that had once smelled of bread and cinnamon, died screaming into the wooden floor. Neighbors sealed the doors with boards and marked the walls with crosses. In cities like Florence, the structure of society began to shatter. Nobles fled their villas, abandoning their peasants. Merchants closed their shops and turned inward, barricading themselves inside with what food they had. Priests stopped visiting the sick. The poor wandered the streets, some delirious, others singing hymns or tearing their clothes in despair. Gravediggers could not keep pace. The bells tolled constantly, so much so that people no longer heard them. Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio would later write of how lovers abandoned each other, Parents left their children to die, and brothers refused to bury brothers. The normal rules no longer applied. Death was not rare, it was expected. In Lucca, carts rolled daily down the streets, filled with corpses. The living would call out to the cart drivers like merchants once called for bread or fish. "Take this one too. Take my son. Take my father." The carts rolled on, dumping the dead into hastily dug pits outside the city walls. No prayers, no last rites, only silence and smoke from the burning. By the summer of 1348, the plague had reached Rome. The Eternal City had survived centuries of war, sieges, and schism, but it had never faced anything like this. Pilgrims from across Christendom who had come seeking salvation now dropped dead in alleyways. The Pope, Clement VI, retreated to Avignon, isolating himself between walls of flame, hoping the fire would purify the air. He issued indulgences en masse, granting forgiveness to the dead who had no priest to hear their last confession. But Rome, for all its relics and saints, could not halt the tide. The catacombs beneath the city became full again. Statues of the Virgin were stained with soot, the incense replaced by the stench of rot. Back in Florence, a group of 10 survivors, mostly nobility and wealthy merchants, fled the city and took refuge in a villa in the countryside. There, they told each other stories to pass the time, to forget the horrors just beyond the trees. Their tales would one day become the Decameron, a collection of fiction born from the darkest reality. It was a desperate attempt to preserve joy, humor, and human connection in a world that seemed to be ending. In Venice, the great port city of canals and carnival masks, the plague spread silently through the water trade. The merchants tried to enforce quarantine. Ships were kept offshore for 40 days, a practice that gave birth to the word quarantina. But it was too late. Gondoliers began transporting bodies instead of passengers. The narrow alleys became hunting grounds for the sickness, and the lagoon carried more than salt and fish. It carried the scent of death. Some believed the air itself was corrupted. Bad air, or miasma, they called it. They burned lavender and rosemary. They held orange peels soaked in vinegar under their noses. Doctors wore terrifying masks, shaped like birds, with beaks stuffed with spices and herbs, but none of it worked. The pestilence was indifferent to masks, prayers, or wealth. In the countryside, the plague was no less merciless. Farms were left untended as entire families died in their homes. Shepherds abandoned their flocks. Cows wandered into empty villages. In some hamlets, no one remained to ring the church bell or light the fire at night. Panic bred madness. In parts of Germany and France, mobs rose up in fury. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned the wells. Entire communities were massacred, burned alive in synagogues, drowned in rivers, butchered in marketplaces. The plague had no need of scapegoats, but it found them anyway. Meanwhile, in Paris, the university scholars argued over causes. Some blamed Saturn and Jupiter's conjunction in 1345. Others blamed the corruption of the Earth's balance or divine wrath for mankind's sins. But none had answers that could stop the dying. Even the King of France, Philip VI, isolated himself. Royal astrologers warned of doom. Physicians prescribed bleeding, herbal baths, and powdered emeralds, all useless. Royal guards died beside chimney sweeps. The plague respected no station. As the year drew to a close, the rhythm of life in Europe changed forever. The sound of hammers and song gave way to silence and weeping. Wedding processions became funerals. Baptisms stopped. Newborns died before they were named. In the snow-covered villages of Burgundy, a monk named Matthias wrote in his diary, It is the end of days. Death walks with no cloak. The horses do not neigh. The children do not laugh. The bells are silent because no one lives to ring them. And yet, somehow, not all succumbed. For reasons no one understood, then or now, some people survived untouched. In homes where entire families died, one child might live. Some priests, who administered last rites to hundreds, emerged unscathed. The randomness of death was as cruel as it was mysterious. As 1348 bled into 1349, the Black Death crossed the Alps into Germany, moved up the Rhone, and began its deadly journey toward England, Scandinavia, and the northern coasts. But already, in Italy, the world had changed. The bustling cities of the Renaissance were now hollow. The political order was cracking. Feudal lords found their fields empty. Guilds lost their craftsmen. Entire generations were gone, leaving only memories and ashes. But beneath the horror, something else stirred. A reckoning, a realization. The world would not return to what it had been. And the plague? It was still only beginning. The spring of 1349 came late to the French countryside. The rains lingered longer than usual, and the wheat sprouted in patches like the splotchy, dying skin of the afflicted. By now, word of the sickness was everywhere, spoken in whispers by washerwomen by the river, muttered by traveling friars who had long since given up their sermons and now spoke only in warnings. But to many in the heart of France, it was still a distant rumor, an Italian nightmare, a tale from across the Alps. That illusion would not last the season. The plague came to France not like a siege, but like a phantom, unseen and unstoppable. It arrived through merchants who fled Genoa, through pilgrims returning from Rome, through soldiers marching home from southern garrisons, and with them, death. It took root first in Marseille, where ships laden with wine and cloth also bore rats and their plague-ridden fleas. The first deaths were dismissed. A sailor here, a cook there. But then the stevedores dropped dead in the docks. Then a bishop, then half the city. In Avignon, where the papacy resided after its exile from Rome, Pope Clement VI had already heard the warnings. Unlike many rulers, he did not flee. Instead, he ordered 2 large bonfires, built on either side of his chambers, in the Palais des Papes. Physicians had told him fire might purify the air. Between the walls of flame he held mass, issued indulgences for the dead, and watched his cardinals die one by one. He granted blanket absolution to all plague victims, knowing few would have a priest to hear their last confession. Outside the palace walls, the corpses mounted. Bodies floated in the Rhone River until the water itself seemed cursed. One of the first to feel the full force of the plague beyond the south was Beaulieu, a small town nestled along a trade road in the Auvergne. It had never known greatness nor disaster until now. The townspeople were mostly peasants, tending sheep and barley, baking bread in communal ovens, and living with the same quiet rhythm as their ancestors. When the first signs came, a sick traveler from the south, a farmer with swollen glands, no one understood. The village priest, Father Eloy, thought it was an early summer fever. He prayed, laid hands on the dying, administered last rites. Within 10 days, he was dead. Within 3 weeks, Beaulieu was empty. Entire families disappeared, their houses boarded shut by the few terrified survivors. Livestock wandered the empty fields. Wolves returned to the woods nearby. Nature crept in as humanity withered. The plague did not spare the cities either. In Paris, the heart of France and the pride of Christendom, the death toll became so great that the bishop ordered new cemeteries built outside the city walls. Les Innocents, once a quiet resting place, became a mountain of corpses. The smell blanketed the city in a miasma of despair. Isabeau Leclerc, a midwife from the Marais district, kept a careful record in a small, leather-bound notebook. She had delivered over 100 babies in her lifetime. Now she wrote of the dead, hundreds, their names, their ages, their last words. When her own daughter fell ill, she tried every remedy. Sage compresses, vinegar, bleeding. None worked. The girl died in her arms. Isabeau burned her house and disappeared. Her notebook was found years later, buried in a wall, its pages stained with tears. From Paris, the plague followed the rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Saône, flowing like ink across parchment. The chateaux of the Loire Valley became tombs. In Orléans, the university closed. In Chartres, pilgrims abandoned the cathedral. Students, monks, merchants, everyone either died or fled. In the rural provinces, the plague carved deep, lasting scars. Villages disappeared completely, abandoned without explanation. In Limousin, entire parishes vanished. Fields went unplowed. Churches fell silent. The absence of bells was as loud as the tolling itself. In Rouen, a merchant named Etienne de Roche tried to remain calm. He kept his shop open as long as he could, selling spices and dried fruits to those desperate for remedies. He wore a lavender sachet around his neck, as the physicians advised. He refused to believe the rumors of cities burning their dead, of priests dying mid-sermon. But when his youngest child, Marie, collapsed with fever and blackened fingertips, he stopped selling. He sent his wife and sons into the countryside and stayed behind to care for Marie. 3 weeks later, all that remained of him was a letter to his family, folded into her shawl. "Forgive me, I could not leave her. I see now that God tests the heart, not with riches, but with love." By the late summer of 1349, the Black Death had passed through France like a wildfire, leaving only smoldering embers of the civilization it touched. Estimates say half of the population died, perhaps more. In some towns it was said that the living could not bury the dead fast enough, so they stopped trying. Dogs dragged bodies into the street. Pigs rooted through the yards of the dead. But the horror did not stop at France's borders. The Alps had long stood as a majestic wall, separating Italy from the heart of Europe, but they were no barrier to the plague. As traders, monks, and refugees poured into Switzerland, Bavaria, and Austria, the pestilence came with them. In the passes of Chur and St. Gothard, monks tried to stop travelers, fearing they brought death. But it was too late. The disease was already in the straw of their beds, in the breath of the acolytes, in the cloisters. One monk wrote, "We opened the monastery gates to tend the sick. Now we are all sick, all except Brother Martin, who has gone mad and sings hymns to the corpses." In Vienna, the plague erupted in the marketplaces and bakeries, spreading like wildfire. The archbishop wept as he conducted mass in an empty cathedral. The city's wealth, its libraries and palaces, offered no shield. In Salzburg, as in parts of France, panic turned to fury. Rumors spread that the Jews had caused the plague by poisoning wells. Accusations grew louder. Fear turned to rage. Entire Jewish communities were arrested, tortured, and burned. In Strasbourg, over 900 Jews were killed in one day. The plague needed no justification, but people gave it one anyway. Hatred became another contagion. And still, the plague moved. It flowed through the Rhine, reached Cologne, whispered into the vineyards of the Moselle, and found its way toward England, Scandinavia, and the cities of the north. Europe had no answers. No prayers worked, no relics healed, no charms or amulets stopped the bleeding. The people began to believe that the world was ending. But the plague was not yet finished. The sea was quiet that morning. A thick, unnatural fog blanketed the Thames estuary, dulling the sounds of gulls and creaking masts. On the horizon, a Genoese ship sat, motionless in the grey water, its sails half lowered and black with rot and salt. It had come from Calais, before that, from Bordeaux, and before that, somewhere south of the Alps, where the sun had once shone brightly and the vineyards had smelled of sweet wine. But now it brought no cargo of value, no spices, no wool, only death. It was June of 1348, and the Isle of Portland was the first to fall. There, dockworkers unloaded a small vessel said to have broken from a merchant convoy during a storm. A few of the crew disembarked, coughing and delirious. They collapsed in the grass, and within days, the men who had helped them died the same way, fevered, blackened, and swollen. The English crown was informed by riders, but the court was slow to act. Disease was common. Why should this one be different? From the coast of Dorset, the plague made quick work of the English countryside. Melcombe Regis, a bustling town of trade, fell silent within weeks. Entire households collapsed in on themselves. Priests rode through the villages, offering mass burials instead of last rites. Fields lay fallow. The cattle lowed at dawn, with no one to tend them. The sky, as always, remained clear, mocking the horror below. In Bristol, the second largest port in England, panic set in early. The town had thrived on trade, leather, wool, salt, but when the first deaths came, the merchants shuttered their shops. The mayor declared the gates closed to foreigners, but it was too late. The rats were already within. Within 2 months, the city's graveyards overflowed. Bodies were loaded into carts by parish beadles, most of whom died by the end of that same week. Bells tolled until the ropes wore thin and snapped. In a cramped stone house near Temple Church, a scribe named Giles de Lacy recorded the passing of the days, even as he watched his wife and 2 sons die. In his final entry, written with trembling hand, he scrawled, "I have buried them beneath the orchard tree. There are no prayers left in me. If I wake tomorrow, I will not weep. If I do not, I will not notice." The silence of Canterbury Cathedral, once filled with choristers, echoed like a tomb. Pilgrims had long come there to seek miracles, to touch the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. Now, even the clergy fled. The shrine was stripped by looters, and in its shadow the plague festered. By August, it reached London. The capital of England, crowded, stinking, and alive with trade, had always danced with disease. The Thames was thick with refuse. Pigs wandered the narrow lanes. People lived stacked in timber homes, sharing space with rats and rotting straw. Yet even London was unprepared for the black tide now rising. It began in Suffolk, near the docks. A Flemish tailor died in his sleep, then his children, then the man next door. The infection ran block to block, house to house. Within a fortnight, funeral carts were full. Graves were dug 20 feet deep and still overflowed. A foul wind carried the stench across the river. King Edward III, who had ruled with martial strength for nearly 20 years, ordered all of London's roads monitored and the sick quarantined. But no wall or law could hold back the invisible killer. Edward's own daughter, Princess Joan, was engaged to a Spanish prince. She set sail for Castile in September, but as the plague raged aboard the royal fleet, she was forced to disembark in Bordeaux, where she died screaming in a rented manor house, her body burned by terrified attendants. Her death shook the court. Edward withdrew to Windsor Castle, ordering no one to approach unless cleansed with vinegar and herbs. Messages passed through gloved hands. Even his most loyal counselors kept their distance. But the plague respected no class. In Westminster Abbey, the monks began to die in pairs. The abbot continued to ring the bells himself until one day the ropes hung silent, the tower unmanned. Londoners began to flee the city. They took the old Roman roads north, west, east, carrying the plague with them like pollen on the wind. Everywhere they went, it bloomed. In the Midlands, entire villages vanished. Eyam, Cottingham, Much Wenlock. Some were abandoned altogether. In Norwich, desperate officials ordered public prayers and banned dancing, drinking, and gambling. But the plague took no notice. In York, the Archbishop conducted mass funerals daily until he too died. Monasteries were turned into makeshift hospitals. The dead were buried with no rites, their names lost. Peasants stopped ploughing fields. Laborers demanded higher wages. Nobles grumbled, but they had no one left to till the soil. Among the commoners, strange cults emerged. The flagellants, barefoot and hooded, marched town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public squares, crying out that the wrath of God had fallen. Crowds gathered to watch them, terrified and fascinated, but no mercy followed their punishments. The plague continued. In Cambridge, once teeming with students and clergy, classrooms stood empty, scrolls molded on abandoned desks. In Oxford, 20 of the 30 professors died within 2 months. Universities collapsed, knowledge paused, and yet, as always, there were those who endured. In the hills of Wales, a shepherd boy named Roderick Howell lived alone after the rest of his family died. He wrote his name in charcoal on the wall of their croft with the words, "I am still here." When monks from Carmarthen passed by that way years later, they found the wall still standing and nothing else. By the end of 1349, nearly 1/3 of England's population was gone. Some towns, like Dunwich and Winchelsea, never recovered. The forests grew back around abandoned hamlets. The roads cracked with weeds. Yet not all was destruction. Out of the chaos, a new world began to take shape. The social order had fractured. Laborers now demanded payment, not obligation. Serfs fled their lords and found better wages elsewhere. Priests who had survived were in short supply, and churches opened their doors to new kinds of leadership. Even the crown, staggered by the loss of nobles and tax revenue, was forced to reckon with a changing kingdom. But the changes would take time. For now, England stood in mourning. The bells rang slower. The fields grew wild. The air smelled of smoke, lavender, and something darker. The Black Death had not finished its journey. It moved onward, toward Ireland, Scandinavia, and the distant Baltic shores. And behind it, a continent mourned not just the dead, but the world that had once been. The wind off the Atlantic was cold and thick with salt as it blew across the jagged coastlines of Ireland. In the early months of 1350, the island sat like a shadow behind the storm clouds of Western Europe, remote and rugged. A land of green fields, stone crosses, and ancient monasteries. Word of the plague had reached it long before the sickness did, passed by sailors who docked in Dublin and by monks who crossed the sea with bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. Ireland had watched Europe burn. Its people heard tales of Paris buried in corpses, of London's black pits, of Florence deserted, and Rome choking in incense and death. But as the months rolled forward and the winds remained untainted, many believed they had been spared by God's mercy. The monasteries prayed constantly, and bells rang across the hills of Connaught, Leinster, and Munster, calling down protection. But the mercy would not last. The first ship arrived from Bristol, its crew silent and slumped in the darkness of its hold. It drifted into Waterford Harbour like a coffin set afloat. Dock workers approached cautiously, called out in Irish and Norman French. No one responded. A few men climbed aboard. What they found made them stagger backward. Twisted bodies, bloated and stiff, the stink unbearable. But the fleas needed no permission. They leapt from rats to boots, from boots to soil. The ship was set aflame and pushed out to sea. But it was too late. Waterford was gone within weeks. The sickness spread with unnatural speed, pouring into the winding streets of Kilkenny, where Friar John Glynn, a Franciscan chronicler, wrote with desperate clarity. He had kept a careful record of Ireland's history for years, detailing disputes between lords, famines, eclipses, but now his words turned to death. The plague has come, and men fall in heaps like sheaves. I write this so that someone may remember what we were, if anyone is left to remember at all. He died soon after. A second hand added a final line in trembling ink. Here the author ended, and no one else remains. The Norman Irish lords in their great stone halls fell alongside their Gaelic vassals. Disease did not care for bloodlines or dialects. In Cork, Clonmel, and Limerick, churches became morgues, and entire villages were swallowed by bramble and mist. In the far west, near Galway, communities sealed themselves in. They barred their gates and prayed for the winds to change direction. Some believed the mountains would protect them. Some were right. Others were simply lucky. Far to the northeast, beyond the forests of Germany and the crags of Bohemia, the plague traveled slower, but not gentler. The routes to Scandinavia were fewer, colder, and longer. But the disease came still, carried in ships that hugged the North Sea, in fur traders from the Baltic, in the breath of one dying sailor. In Denmark, it landed in the port town of Ribe in 1350. The Danes had heard of the horror to the south. King Valdemar the Fourth had prepared, setting up guards along the roads, ordering quarantine of merchant ships, but he could not keep out the tide. Ribe fell, and with it, the entire Jutland Peninsula began to sicken. By midsummer, the countryside was desolate. In Odense, the bishop died during Mass. In Aarhus, cattle wandered through market squares. The fishers of the Kattegat no longer returned to port. The Danes burned their dead in great pyres beside their churches. Some towns held public processions, beating drums and chanting hymns in an effort to frighten away the plague. But it did not scare easily. Across the sea in Norway, the story was no less grim. The plague reached Bergen in the fall of 1349, on an English ship carrying wool. The Norwegians tried to isolate the crew, but rats slipped off the gangplanks and disappeared into the cracks of the town. Within days, the merchant quarter stank of corpses. In Oslo, King Magnus VII ordered a week of fasting and prayer, banning drinking and festivity. But divine silence met their pleas. Priests collapsed during sermons. Funeral carts moved in silent pairs. Fishermen stopped hauling in cod. The fjords, always echoing with life, became still. One chronicler in Trondheim wrote, "We thought the mountains might protect us, but now the sickness walks through them like a ghost through walls." Even the remoteness of Sweden could not hold back the storm. It arrived by overland routes through Skåne and spread like frost across the realm. The Kingdom of Sweden, already weakened by internal conflict, found its cities emptying. In Uppsala, professors fled. In Stockholm, the pestilence crept into castles and hovels alike. In isolated villages among the Lapland frontier, some communities heard of the plague only months later. They saw the signs, fires in the distance, caravans that never returned, silence in the trees. They stopped accepting strangers. In some places, isolation saved them. In others, it simply delayed the inevitable. In the east, the Black Death's progress was patchier, but no less devastating. The cities of Poland watched from afar as their neighbors perished. The Kingdom of Poland, under Casimir Thurthu the Great, took quick action. Roads were closed. Travelers were turned away. Quarantine was enforced, especially around Krakow. where city guards carried spears not just for defense, but to keep people out. For a time, it worked. Poland was among the few regions that saw relative shelter from the plague's initial waves. But rumors swirled. Had Casimir made a pact with God? Was it sorcery? Many pointed to the Jewish communities who were spared early infection and blamed them with blind hatred. In cities like Poznan and Lviv, mobs formed. Accusations of well poisoning rose. Pogroms followed. Hundreds of Jews were slaughtered in panicked rage, though they too would later fall to the plague. Further east, the vast plains of Lithuania, Moldavia, and the territories of Kievan Rus offered fewer roads for the disease to travel, but eventually it came. The Dnieper River carried more than trade. Rats floated down on driftwood, hiding among bales of fur and grain. Settlements along the riverbanks fell silent. In Novgorod, where the Orthodox Church held sway with silver crosses and incense, priests conducted masses over empty pews. Families locked themselves behind thick wooden walls, burying their dead in gardens rather than risk the journey to churchyards. Snow fell early that year, but even it could not cleanse the land. As the winter of 1350 approached, the Black Death had touched nearly every corner of Europe, from the rocky fjords of Norway to the marshes of Galicia, from the towers of Krakow to the cliffs of Ireland. There were no longer any frontiers, only survivors and ghosts. The old world was cracking, and though the dying began to slow, the world that would emerge would not be the same. The Black Death had burned through kings and bishops, monks and mayors, mothers and children alike, but it had also left behind empty land, unclaimed titles, lawless roads, and a hunger, not just of the body, but of the soul. It would take decades to understand it all. But the survivors, numb and changed, had already begun to reshape their world. The bells had stopped ringing. That was the first thing people noticed. No more slow, mournful tolls echoing through the village hills. No more funerals, no more chanting priests, just wind. The low whine of wind across empty fields, through hollow houses, across burnt villages and rotting orchards. The year was 1351, and Europe had fallen quiet. For nearly 4 years, the Black Death had moved like a shadow across the continent, taking between 75 to 200 million lives. No one could agree on a number. No one wanted to count anymore. Entire towns had vanished from memory. Maps were redrawn not because of war or conquest, but because no one lived in those places anymore. And now, after the storm, came the reckoning. The survivors, those few who had watched friends, parents, and children die, one by one, emerged from behind their shuttered homes like ghosts, their eyes sunken, their bodies gaunt, their minds unmoored. Some walked from village to village, calling out names that no longer belonged to anyone. Others wandered the woods barefoot, whispering prayers to a god they no longer trusted. In the town of Bayeux, a woman named Jeanne de Morlaix re-emerged from a root cellar with her 3 sons. They had hidden for 2 months, living on dried beans and salted pork, emerging only to gather rainwater. When they opened the door, they found the entire village gone, streets choked with weeds, windows gaping open like mouths. She covered her children's eyes and took them toward the next town. She would find only more ruins. In England, across the fertile fields of Kent, a noble named Sir Alaric de Grey returned to his manor with a handful of servants. The great hall, once full of fire and music, was empty. The servants' quarters had collapsed from neglect. The fields were overgrown. The tenants were gone, dead or fled. He sat at the long table alone, dressed in a velvet robe that now seemed absurd. That night, he burned the family crest. The plague had not just killed bodies, it had unmade the entire structure of medieval life. Feudalism already a strained system, cracked beneath the weight of labor shortages. With so many dead, serfs and peasants suddenly found themselves in demand. Where once they had been chained to the land by obligation and tradition, now they could demand wages. If one lord refused, they would walk to the next. For the first time, movement was freedom. In Florence, the silk guilds paid double to surviving workers. In York, entire manors offered land grants to anyone willing to till the soil. Kings issued edicts to keep wages fixed, but no one listened. Power had shifted, the poor had survived, and they knew their worth now. But with that shift came fear from the ruling class. In London, King Edward III issued the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and forbid workers from leaving their masters. But his own sheriffs could not enforce it. Fields lay empty, labourers left in the night, and when they returned, they came with contracts and demands. In France, noble families disappeared altogether, their names extinguished by the plague. Castles stood empty. Inheritance records collapsed. The church tried to claim abandoned lands, but local villagers refused to cede control. The old hierarchy began to wobble. Even in the church, long seen as the spiritual backbone of Europe, doubt and disillusionment festered. How could a loving God allow such death? How could the clergy, who died in equal numbers, offer protection? Many had watched priests abandon the sick, or worse, demand gold for final rites. Respect turned to suspicion. In Cologne, a young monk named Brother Anselm wrote, "I no longer know if we are saved. The good died screaming, the wicked died smiling. We were told the righteous would be spared. We were not." Some turned to flagellant cults, marching barefoot across Europe, whipping themselves until their blood stained the streets, crying out for mercy. Others turned to pagan customs, reviving ancient rituals, burning herbs, chanting to the wind and trees. In Bohemia, a movement began where people worshipped death itself. They painted skeletal murals on church walls. They built ossuaries, chapels made of human bones. Skulls lined altars. Femurs formed crosses. Death was no longer something to fear. It was familiar now. It lived among them. But not all change was spiritual or political. The economy had to be rebuilt from ashes. With fewer mouths to feed, grain prices plummeted. With fewer workers, wages rose. Artisans could now choose their patrons. Merchants gained power over aristocrats. A new middle class was beginning to form. In Venice, a city once known for its carnival masks and merchant fleets, the survivors developed a system to try and prevent future devastation. Ships arriving from distant ports were ordered to anchor for 40 giorni, 40 days, before unloading. It was the birth of the quarantine. In Paris, students returned to the universities, but their lectures had changed. Less theology, more medicine. Anatomy, once taboo, became essential. Bodies were dissected not out of sacrilege, but necessity. The seeds of the Renaissance were being sown. In blood, yes, but also in curiosity. Amid the grief and ruin, beauty still stirred. In Florence, painter Francesco Traini created the great fresco, The Triumph of Death, showing skeletons riding horseback through aristocratic gardens. A reminder to the rich and powerful that death spared no one. In Germany, poets wrote of empty homes where only the wind spoke. In Ireland, bards sang of vanished clans and the bitter silence left behind. And in Spain, survivors built churches not to celebrate life, but to honor those who did not live. Yet for all the horror, humanity endured. Children were born again. Fields were plowed again. Markets reopened. Cautiously, music returned. Quieter now, but no less meaningful. The survivors, scarred, thinner, changed, looked at the world with new eyes. They no longer trusted blindly. They no longer feared as easily. They had passed through death's shadow and found that nothing in life could be taken for granted again. In 1351, the final major waves of the Black Death began to wane. It did not vanish. It would return in later decades, but its initial fire had burned itself out. Europe would never be the same, but it was still standing. It was often in the quiet moments that the memories crept in. The flicker of torchlight on a stone wall, the hush of wind through broken church windows, the way a crow called across a lonely field. These were the sounds of survival, and for many, they were the only things louder than the dead. By 1351, the Black Death had loosened its grip on Europe, but what it left behind was something deeper than bones in a pit or ruined crops. It had hollowed out the minds of the living, like rot in the core of a tree. Survivors stumbled through the world like men waking from a fever, not knowing if what they saw was real or simply what was left. They called it plague madness in some places. In others, they called it divine grief. But no matter what name they gave it, the feeling was the same. A sense that the world had shifted and would never feel safe again. In Avignon, once thick with the stench of death and incense, Pope Clement VI walked through the palace gardens alone. He had survived the worst of it, surrounded by flames that his physicians said would purify the air. But he could not burn away the memories of the corpses floating down the Rhone, or the faces of cardinals who dropped mid-prayer. He spoke rarely in those years. His scribes said he seemed older, even when he was silent. He had once believed that his prayers might stop the plague. Now he prayed only for forgetfulness. Elsewhere, people dealt with the pain as best they could. In Flanders, a weaver named Leontine carved the names of her family into a wooden panel beside her door. 12 names. She had once laughed, often and loud. Now she sat in silence most days, muttering prayers no priest had taught her. The neighbors left food outside her house, but never knocked. In Siena, the painters were the first to turn grief into image. The frescoes on church walls shifted from bright visions of Christ's miracles to grim dances of skeletons leading the living in a solemn procession. The Danse Macabre. Death, they painted, came not as a thief in the night, but as a partner in life. He danced with peasants and popes alike. No one could escape the music. This new art was not simply a form of beauty. It was memory etched in plaster and pigment. In the frescoes of Pisa, Florence, and Lubeck, death was no longer hidden. He was crowned. He was familiar. Poets followed the artists. In Germany, a scribe named Peter of Erfurt compiled a book of laments, each page describing a different city's fall, a different burial mound, a different kind of sorrow. In England, chroniclers recorded stories in margins of prayer books, their ink uneven from shaking hands. In one margin of a prayer scroll found in York, a monk wrote simply, "The Lord is silent, and so I write what I see. Crows in the steeple, dust in the font. No one has come to Mass in 6 days." The trauma ran deeper than words could reach. Some became hermits, others drowned their memories in drink or devotion. But always, there was the question, why? The plague had no face. It made no demands. It punished good and evil alike. It left behind the cruel and killed the kind. It had unmade the rules. In Prague, philosophers argued whether it had been God's wrath or simply nature's cruelty. Some said it was the alignment of planets. Others blamed foul air. But in the taverns and fields, among the common folk, the answers mattered less than the pain itself. Mothers feared to love their children too deeply. Lovers married in haste. expecting death before harvest. Children played in graveyards, never knowing a world without funerals. Laughter returned, but it was nervous, always followed by a glance over the shoulder. There were moments of light. In Tournai, a group of survivors formed a guild, not of merchants or craftsmen, but of memory. They gathered stories from towns and villages, writing them down, not to glorify the dead, but to remember they had once lived. Names were saved, events were recorded. They believed that forgetting would be the second death. Elsewhere, superstition grew. In Spain, mothers tied iron charms to their children's wrists. In Germany, garlic was worn like a talisman. In Poland, people left bread offerings on doorsteps to appease wandering spirits. Anything to feel in control again. But control was a fiction now. The world had changed, and the people who lived in it had changed too. The nobility, once proud and aloof, now walked among the commoners in search of labor. A baron might offer land to a man who a year ago would not have been allowed to speak in court. The hierarchy cracked, and new voices rose. In Paris, young clerks wrote bold letters challenging church decrees. In Florence, sculptors carved more realistic faces, weathered and wrinkled, no longer seeking only perfection. In London, playwrights added sorrow to their comedies. Every joy carried the weight of death behind it. The Black Death had given the world something terrible and something new, the ability to question everything. The past was broken. The future was uncertain. But in the present, people lived with urgency. Food was eaten hot. Love was declared quickly. Songs were louder. Paintings more vivid. There was no promise of tomorrow, and so everything had to matter now. Among the Jews of Prague, one rabbi wrote a prayer unlike any before. It did not beg for protection. It did not demand answers. It simply said, "We remember. We remember what the wind carried and what the fire could not burn. We remember those who kissed their children one last time. We remember the silence that came after." As the 1350s waned and the horror faded into memory, the survivors carried the weight forward. They raised children who would never know the old world. They told stories of what they had seen. Some whispered them as warnings. Others sang them as ballads. But no one forgot. The fires had burned themselves out. The streets, once choked with the bodies of the dead, were cleared, often by hands that trembled with exhaustion and grief. The cities of Europe stood battered but stubbornly alive. From Venice to Paris, from London to Florence, the survivors faced the daunting task of rebuilding a world that had been nearly erased. In Florence, the heart of the Italian peninsula, the plague's aftermath was both ruin and opportunity. The once crowded quarters where merchants, artisans, and laborers lived were now hollowed out, yet from this emptiness, a new social order began to take shape. The guilds, which had once controlled trade and labor, found their membership thinned, but their power increased. Skilled artisans commanded higher wages and greater respect. Families who had lost heirs sought apprentices to carry on their crafts, sometimes from distant lands. Cosimo de' Medici, an emerging banker, recognized this changing tide. His family fortune grew as others perished, and with it, he began to wield influence not only over commerce, but also over politics. The Medici's patronage of artists, architects, and scholars planted the early seeds of the Renaissance, a flowering of culture and knowledge that would forever alter Europe. Farther north, Paris struggled to recover from the loss of nearly half its population. The university reopened, but the curriculum shifted. The plague had exposed the limits of traditional learning. Medical faculties expanded their studies, dissecting bodies to better understand the human form. Scholars debated the causes of disease moving away from solely spiritual explanations toward observation and science. The seeds of empirical inquiry were planted amid the ruins, but it was not just culture and learning that changed. The very structure of power was shifting. Kings, nobles, and clergy all faced a shrinking pool of laborers and soldiers. Serfs, once tied to the land by birthright and obligation, found themselves in demand. Many abandoned their feudal lords, seeking better conditions in towns and cities. This exodus weakened the old order. In England, the Crown tried to stem the tide with the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which aimed to freeze wages and restrict movement. But enforcement was patchy at best. Many peasants simply ignored the law, knowing their labour was scarce and valuable. This tension would eventually contribute to unrest, including the Peasants' Revolt, later in the century. The Church, too, grappled with its diminished authority. Having lost countless clergy and monks to the plague, many parishes were left without priests. Those who remained were often inexperienced or corrupt, fueling calls for reform. The spiritual crisis deepened as common people questioned why God had allowed such suffering. In Avignon, the papacy faced increasing criticism, and the seeds of the Great Schism were sown as rival popes competed for legitimacy. Meanwhile, cities invested in infrastructure to prevent future outbreaks. Quarantine stations, or lazarettos, were established at ports. Venice was a pioneer, requiring ships to anchor for 40 days before unloading, a practice whose name, 40 giorni, would give rise to the word quarantine. These public health measures were early attempts at controlling disease, blending medieval superstition with nascent science. The economic upheaval also spurred innovation. With fewer hands to till the soil, landlords experimented with new farming techniques, crop rotation, selective breeding, and more efficient tools were slowly introduced. Markets expanded as trade networks reoriented, and towns grew as centers of commerce and craft. This reshaping of society was not peaceful. Conflicts erupted over land, wages, and authority. The destabilized social order created openings for revolutionaries, religious dissenters, and reformers. The intellectual ferment of the Renaissance, the calls for religious renewal that would later fuel the Reformation, and the political upheavals of the late Middle Ages all trace their roots to the devastation wrought by the Black Death. In the wake of the plague, Europe had been forever changed, not only in population, but in spirit and structure. From the ashes of death rose new orders of life, knowledge, and power. The plague had swept through Europe like a ravenous storm, leaving behind silent villages, emptied fields, and grieving families. Yet amid the ruin, from the deepest wells of despair, something remarkable began to emerge. A flicker of light in the darkness, a restless curiosity that would ignite what we now call the Renaissance. Florence, once a city cloaked in shadow and sorrow, became a crucible for this new spirit. Its narrow, winding streets echoed with cautious footsteps as survivors returned to rebuild homes and markets. The frescoes that had once adorned the chapels with gold and rigid iconography gave way to something more visceral, paintings that showed the very flesh of humanity, its joys and its pain. In a small workshop near the Ponte Vecchio, a young apprentice named Luca Di Paolo dipped his brush in vibrant pigments, trying to capture the haunted eyes of a widow who had lost her entire family. His master, Giovanni Bellini, watched silently, nodding. They were no longer painting saints untouched by suffering, but people who had stared death in the face and lived to tell the tale. "Remember," Giovanni whispered, "we paint not just for the heavens, but for those who still walk the earth." This change in art reflected a broader awakening. Scholars pored over the scrolls and codices recovered from monastic libraries, many of which had been saved from destruction. They sought the wisdom of the ancients, texts by Plato, Aristotle, and Virgil, not merely to repeat old knowledge, but to question and build upon it. The philosophy of humanism gained momentum. It celebrated human dignity and potential, emphasizing individual experience over blind faith. This was a profound shift in thought. The Black Death had shattered the unquestioning belief that life was preordained by divine will. Instead, survivors looked to the human mind and spirit for answers. At the University of Padua, once ravaged by plague and despair, professors reopened their halls with renewed purpose. The medical school, in particular, became a beacon of hope. Physicians like Mondino de Luzzi led dissections, peeling back the layers of the human body in a quest to understand life and disease. Though medicine was still rudimentary by modern standards, these early pioneers challenged centuries of dogma. "Feel the pulse of knowledge," Mondino said to his students as they gathered around a cadaver. "Death has taken so many, but from their silence, we must learn." Outside academia, technological innovations stirred. Though the printing press had yet to revolutionize Europe, the slow spread of manuscripts and translated works began to erode the Church's monopoly on knowledge. Cartographers refined maps that hinted at lands beyond the horizon, fueling dreams of exploration. Artisans applied mathematics to achieve perspective in paintings and architecture, crafting buildings and images that felt alive. Yet the scars of the plague lingered. Religious life was transformed in ways both subtle and dramatic. Some turned away from the Church, embittered by its failures during the crisis. Others sought solace in mystical practices and personal piety, hoping to reconnect with a God who had seemed silent during their darkest hours. The streets of Paris and Rome were filled with both fervent believers and skeptical thinkers. The tension between tradition and innovation simmered, eventually leading to calls for reform that would echo for centuries. As the years passed, the memory of the Black Death was both a shadow and a catalyst. It reminded people of life's fragility, but also ignited a hunger to seize the day, to learn, create, and transform. In Florence's bustling squares, the wealthy Medici family rose to prominence by sponsoring artists and scholars, weaving a network of patronage that helped sustain this cultural rebirth. The statues of Donatello, the frescoes of Masaccio, and the poetry of Petrarch all bore traces of a world reshaped by tragedy. In the countryside, new agricultural techniques, born of necessity during labor shortages, improved yields and freed some peasants from serfdom. Towns expanded, trade flourished, and a new middle class began to emerge, laying the groundwork for the social revolutions ahead. Europe stood at a crossroads, its old medieval order fractured, its future uncertain. The Black Death had claimed millions of lives, but it also unwittingly paved the way for a rebirth of art, science, and humanism that would forever change the course of history. The dawn of the Renaissance was not a sudden light, but a gradual glow, emerging from the ashes of death and despair, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The plague had changed everything. The old world was broken, and the new one had yet to be fully born. For the common people, peasants, laborers, townsfolk, the devastation brought opportunity and demand. Yet for the rulers and nobility, it meant loss, fear, and increasing challenges to their authority. In the decades following the Black Death, Europe became a powder keg of tension and anger. The labor shortages that granted peasants leverage also sparked violent resistance when those demands were denied. The rigid social hierarchies of feudalism, already strained, faced their greatest challenge. England was a cauldron of unrest. After the plague's waves had passed, surviving peasants and labourers found their work in high demand. They demanded better wages and freedom from harsh restrictions. But the Crown and landowners responded with harsh laws like the Statute of Labourers, 1351, designed to freeze wages and bind workers to their lords. Many ignored these laws. In the countryside and towns, resentment simmered, growing like a storm cloud. The young and desperate found new reasons to rebel. By 1381, the tensions exploded into the peasants' revolt. It began in Essex and Kent, sparked by poll taxes imposed to fund the costly wars of King Richard II. But it quickly grew into a broader uprising, a violent challenge to the old order. Thousands of peasants, artisans, and common folk marched on London, their banners emblazoned with calls for justice and freedom. They demanded the abolition of serfdom, fair rents, and an end to oppressive taxation. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, the rebels stormed the city. They burned manors, freed prisoners, and confronted the king himself. The confrontations were brutal. The nobility responded with force, quashing the rebellion and executing its leaders, but the message had been sent. Similar upheavals rippled across the continent. In France, ravaged by the ongoing Hundred Years' War and plague aftershocks, peasants known as the Jacquerie rose in revolt in 1358. Though short-lived and brutally suppressed, it revealed the deep fractures beneath the surface of feudal society. In the German states, tensions between cities and nobles flared. Towns like Nuremberg and Cologne sought greater autonomy, leveraging their economic power gained as trade rebounded after the plague. Across the continent, the weakened nobility faced challenges from both below and within. Royal families squabbled for power, and the church itself was fracturing. The Great Schism of 1378, with rival popes in Rome and Avignon, split the faithful and undermined religious authority further. Many questioned the church's ability to lead, especially after its failures during the plague years. Socially, the upheavals began to erode feudal bonds. Serfs fled manors, towns grew, and a new middle class of merchants, bankers, and artisans emerged. But this transformation was neither smooth nor peaceful. The centuries-old structures that had held Europe together, feudal loyalty, divine right, rigid class hierarchy, were crumbling. The Black Death had not only killed millions, but also shattered the illusion of permanence. The fires of rebellion lit the way for change, for better and worse. The Black Death had devastated Europe not only in body, but in spirit, when the first victims fell ill and died in staggering numbers. The people turned instinctively to the church, their eternal refuge, the presumed shield against all earthly evils. Yet, as the death toll soared and prayers seemed to fall into a silent void, the unshakable foundation of medieval faith began to tremble. In countless towns and villages, priests found themselves overwhelmed. They had been trained to shepherd souls, to offer solace, absolution, and the hope of salvation. But the plague did not discriminate. Clergy died alongside peasants and nobles alike, often in disproportionate numbers due to their ministrations among the sick. In some places, entire parishes were left without a single priest. One such priest was Father Guillaume, serving a small village outside Avignon. He walked from hut to hut, offering last rites to trembling families. His voice cracked as he recited the prayers. Yet with each new death, his certainty faded. "Why, Lord?" he whispered one night as he knelt alone in his chapel. "Why have you forsaken us?" His doubt was not unique. In the plague's wake, many questioned the old assurances that God's justice and mercy were reliable. If the righteous and the sinful perished indiscriminately, what did it mean? Was the Church truly a bastion of salvation, or merely another human institution, fragile and fallible? Pope Clement VI, residing in the relative safety of Avignon's papal court, understood the urgency of preserving faith amid the chaos. In a remarkable move, he issued a papal bull declaring that the plague was not a punishment from God, but rather a natural phenomenon, caused by corrupted air and celestial alignments. This stance was unprecedented, pushing back against widespread beliefs that the pestilence was divine retribution for human sinfulness. Yet for many common folk, such theological nuance was cold comfort. Fear and superstition reigned. In Germany and northern France, groups of flagellants arose, men and women who marched through towns, whipping themselves until blood flowed, begging God's forgiveness in public displays of penance. Their cries pierced the air. "Have mercy, O Lord, have mercy." While some church leaders feared the flagellants' growing influence, viewing them as dangerous heretics who undermined ecclesiastical authority, others understood the movement as an outcry of desperate souls seeking meaning and control amid the chaos. In the streets of Cologne, crowds gathered to witness the spectacle, simultaneously horrified and mesmerized. Children hid behind doors, shopkeepers shuttered windows. Yet the flagellants' fervor was contagious, spreading quickly and compelling even the wary to consider the possibility that only through shared suffering could the plague's wrath be quelled. Tragically, the social upheaval of the plague also exacerbated deep-rooted prejudices. The Jewish communities of Europe, already marginalized, became scapegoats for the unfathomable calamity. Accused of poisoning wells or conspiring with the devil, Jews were hunted, expelled, and massacred in pogroms that left deep scars across regions such as Strasbourg, Toulouse, and beyond. In some cities, bishops and secular authorities tried to protect Jewish populations, recognizing the baseless cruelty of the accusations. Yet widespread fear and hatred often overwhelmed these efforts, illustrating how plague-induced panic could poison the very fabric of society. Amid this turmoil, many sought new forms of spirituality. The official church was often perceived as corrupt or impotent, particularly when clergy were seen to abandon their flocks or demand exorbitant fees for last rites. Movements emphasizing personal, mystical experiences of God flourished. One such figure was Julian of Norwich, an English anchoress whose visions during the plague years offered a message of hope and divine love amidst suffering. Writing revelations of divine love, she proclaimed that despite the pain and destruction, God's love remained steadfast, and all would ultimately be well. Her gentle optimism contrasted sharply with the surrounding despair. At the same time, ascetic movements gained followers, people who renounced worldly pleasures, fasting and praying in solitude, hoping to purify themselves and intercede for humanity. The rise of these practices reflected a profound yearning for control and meaning when the world seemed to have lost both. The plague also exposed cracks within the church's hierarchy. The devastating loss of clergy forced rapid ordinations, sometimes resulting in inexperienced and poorly trained priests. Many surviving clergy were accused of moral failings or neglect. Such conditions fueled widespread calls for reform. The schism that erupted in 1378, known as the Great Schism, fractured the church further, with rival popes in Rome and Avignon claiming legitimacy. The faithful were confused and divided. This crisis of authority opened space for dissent and planted seeds for the religious upheavals of the coming centuries. Yet, amid crisis, faith endured. In towns and cities across Europe, processions resumed, churches were rebuilt, and rituals persisted. Art and literature reflected this complex spiritual landscape. Painters depicted saints who interceded on behalf of the plague-ridden. Illuminated manuscripts featured prayers for protection. Poetry blended lamentation with hope. The works of writers like Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence, conveyed the full spectrum of human experience: fear, loss, resilience, and joy. The Black Death's impact on faith was profound and multifaceted. It shattered old certainties and forced a confrontation with mortality on a scale never before seen. But it also sparked a spiritual transformation, one that questioned authority, deepened personal devotion, and expanded the boundaries of belief. In the end, the Church would survive, but it would never be the same institution that presided over medieval Europe before the plague. Its role was evolving, as was the faith of the people it served, a faith tempered by suffering and enriched by a newfound urgency to seek meaning in a fragile, uncertain world. The Black Death had not only ravaged the bodies of Europe's peoples, it had shaken the very foundations of its economy. The world before the plague had been governed by a delicate, deeply entrenched system of feudal obligations, where peasants were bound to the land and wealth and power concentrated in the hands of a few nobles and clergy. The rhythms of planting, harvesting, and paying dues had cycled predictably for centuries, but the pestilence ripped through this order like a wildfire, leaving behind a shattered landscape, both physical and social. Fields that once brimmed with grain were left fallow, for there were no hands to tend them. Villages, once vibrant with daily toil and commerce, echoed with silence and abandoned homes. In the English countryside, the manor of Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville lay half empty, its granaries half full, its halls quieter than ever. "Where are my peasants?" Sir Geoffrey complained bitterly in a letter to a neighbour. "The earth cries out for planting, yet no soul answers the call." The demographic catastrophe meant a dramatic contraction of the labour pool. Estimates suggest that as much as 30 to 50% of Europe's population had vanished in a matter of years. For the first time in centuries, labour became scarce, and with scarcity came power. Survivors found themselves in a unique position. No longer could lords demand endless work for mere subsistence. Wages rose rapidly as manorial estates competed to attract workers. Peasants, once bound by feudal ties and customs, began to assert their right to fair payment. They migrated from manor to manor, seeking better terms, and many fled to growing towns where the promise of wage labor and freedom from serfdom beckoned. The old order pushed back fiercely. English kings and nobles issued the Statute of Labourers in 1351, an attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict peasants from leaving their lords' lands. But these laws were largely unenforceable. Landowners found themselves powerless as workers simply ignored the restrictions. Across the Channel in France, the aftermath was similarly volatile. The devastation of the plague was compounded by the 100 Years' War, and peasants suffered heavy taxation to support the war effort. When the demands became unbearable, peasants rose in revolt in the 1358 Jacquerie. Though brutally suppressed, the uprising symbolized the deep economic and social fractures. Agriculture itself transformed. Many landowners, facing a shortage of laborers, shifted from growing labor-intensive crops like wheat to raising sheep. Wool became the new gold of medieval Europe, fueling the growth of textile centers in England and Flanders. The shift changed rural landscapes and economies and contributed to the enclosure movement, privatizing common lands, often to the detriment of poor villagers. Meanwhile, urban centers experienced growth and renewal. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Ghent expanded their trade networks. Though trade had suffered initially during the plague years, it rebounded with vigor as merchants sought to satisfy demand for goods, both mundane and luxurious. Spices from the East, fine cloth from Flanders, and exotic objects found eager buyers among Europe's increasingly wealthy middle class. Guilds, organizations that regulated crafts and trade, also evolved. Skilled workers were scarce, and guilds found themselves opening membership to outsiders and apprentices to maintain their industries. This change subtly began to undermine the rigid social stratifications of medieval towns. The rise of merchant and banking families, such as the Medici of Florence, further accelerated economic change. Banking innovations, including letters of credit and bills of exchange, allowed for safer and more efficient trade. Money replaced barter in many transactions, setting Europe on a path toward early capitalism. Yet this new prosperity was not shared equally. Entire villages had been wiped out, and survivors often struggled to reclaim their livelihoods. Orphans and widows faced destitution. The divide between rich and poor grew starker, breeding tension and sometimes violence. Even as cities thrived, the countryside often lagged behind. Many peasants found themselves squeezed by rising rents and the enclosure of common lands. In England, this tension would fuel unrest for decades, culminating in events like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The economic impact of the Black Death was thus profound and far-reaching. It weakened feudal bonds, elevated the status of labor, and sowed the seeds of a new economic order. The medieval world's old certainties about class, labor, and wealth had been irrevocably shaken. By the dawn of the 15th century, Europe was a land in transformation. The scars of plague remained visible in empty villages, altered landscapes, and weary eyes. But beneath those scars grew the first shoots of a new economic and social reality, one that would eventually give rise to modern Europe. The Black Death had been a terrible catastrophe, but out of its ashes rose not only grief and loss, but also change and possibility. The Black Death was not merely a biological catastrophe, it was a cultural earthquake that forever altered the way Europe's people viewed existence. The shadow of the plague stretched long and deep, reaching into the art on cathedral walls, the stories told around hearths, and the very rituals of life and death. In the years following the plague, artists grappled with mortality as never before. The once familiar religious iconography evolved into haunting visions of death and decay. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular motif, a grim procession of skeletons leading the living of all classes to their inevitable end. Painted on church walls from Paris to Prague, it was a chilling reminder. Death comes for king and pauper alike. One of the most poignant examples was in the Church of St. Mary in Lübeck, where a fresco depicted nobles, merchants, clergy, and peasants all dancing hand in hand with skeletons. It was not merely a morbid fascination, but a profound meditation on equality in death. Literature, too, reflected the plague's impact. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the Black Death in Florence, composed the Decameron, a collection of stories told by a group of young people sheltering from the plague. The tales range from the humorous to the tragic, weaving human folly and resilience amid catastrophe. Boccaccio's work captured a world transformed, not only by death, but by the urgency to live and find meaning. His vivid descriptions of the plague's horrors remain some of the earliest eyewitness accounts of the pandemic. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer penned the Canterbury Tales, a work coloured by the social changes wrought by the plague. His characters, from the noble knight to the corrupt pardoner, reveal a society in flux, where old hierarchies were questioned and human nature was laid bare. Folklore and superstition flourished as well. Stories of plague saints, miracle healings, and divine punishment circulated widely. Some believed the Black Death was a visitation from angels, others that it was the work of witches or demons. In many villages, annual rituals and processions were established to commemorate the dead and seek protection from future outbreaks. These traditions, some surviving into modern times, underscore the plague's deep psychological imprint. The collective trauma also fostered a cultural shift toward what scholars call the memento mori, reminders of death intended to encourage reflection on mortality and virtue. Artifacts like skull rings, tomb effigies, and written meditations on death became common among all social classes. Even architecture was influenced. The surge in mortality rates led to innovations in burial practices and church design. Cemeteries expanded, and new ossuaries, charnel houses where bones were stored, were constructed. The macabre beauty of places like the Sedlic ossuary in the Czech Republic stands as a testament to this fusion of reverence and remembrance. The Black Death's cultural echoes also shaped philosophy and theology. Thinkers wrestled with the problem of evil and suffering, the fragility of human life, and the possibility of salvation. These debates would ripple through the centuries, influencing movements from Renaissance humanism to the Reformation. In this way, the plague became more than a historical event. It became a lens through which Europe viewed itself, its values, and its destiny. The legacy of the Black Death, etched in stone, painted on walls, spoken in stories, reminds us that even in the darkest times, humanity seeks meaning and connection. It is a story of death, yes, but also of enduring spirit. The Black Death was an unimaginable catastrophe that tore through Europe's cities and countryside with ruthless efficiency. It left death and despair in its wake and shattered the fragile confidence people had in their world. But from the depths of this devastation arose a slow but profound transformation in how humanity understood disease, medicine, and the natural world. Before the plague, medicine in Europe was largely stagnant. Medical knowledge was derived from classical sources, especially the works of Galen and Hippocrates, whose ideas dominated for over a millennium. The prevailing theory of the four humors dictated treatments: bloodletting, purging, and balancing bodily fluids. Yet these theories were speculative and often harmful. When the plague struck, physicians and healers found themselves powerless. Infected towns saw entire communities wiped out, while doctors, lacking effective treatments, could do little but offer prayers or attempt dangerous and ineffective remedies. Some fled in terror, others persisted, risking death in the line of duty. One of the most tragic episodes was in the city of Florence, where many prominent doctors died treating the sick. The chronicler Agostino Saponi recorded how hospitals overflowed, beds were scarce, and physicians exhausted themselves in a desperate struggle against an invisible enemy. Yet the horror forced the medical community to confront uncomfortable truths. At universities like Padua, Bologna, and Montpellier, the traditional scholastic approach began to give way to empirical observation. The taboo against human dissection was challenged as anatomists sought direct knowledge of the human body. The work of Mondino de Luzzi, who performed one of the first recorded dissections in 1315, inspired others to seek evidence beyond texts. Doctors began to pay closer attention to symptoms, the appearance of buboes, fevers, and rapid decline, and tried to classify them systematically. Though unaware of bacteria or fleas, these observations were critical first steps. Venice, a major trading hub and gateway between East and West, pioneered public health measures that anticipated modern epidemiology. In 1377, the city decreed that all incoming ships must remain isolated for 40 days, quarantina, before passengers or cargo could disembark. This quarantine aimed to halt the importation of disease, marking one of the earliest official uses of isolation in disease control. The establishment of lazarettos, specialized plague hospitals located outside city walls, also became a crucial innovation. These institutions sought to isolate the sick and prevent further contagion. Though rudimentary, they were the precursors to modern hospitals and public health institutions. Beyond these practical measures, physicians began to document their experiences. Guy de Chauliac, the famed French surgeon, survived the plague and composed detailed medical treatises describing symptoms and tentative treatments. His work blended traditional humoral theory with new empirical observations, a cautious step toward modern medicine. Yet alongside these advances, superstition and religious interpretations persisted. Many believed the plague was punishment from God for mankind's sins, and that prayers and repentance were the only remedies. Astrology was widely consulted. Celestial alignments and comets were thought to presage outbreaks. This blend of faith and emerging science created a complex intellectual landscape. Scholars and clergy debated the nature of disease and the universe. The plague forced many to question the Church's authority in explaining natural phenomena, gradually opening the door to secular inquiry. Art and literature also reflected this growing curiosity. Medical illustrations became more detailed and lifelike, aiding in the education of physicians. Writers incorporated plague narratives and observations, documenting the human experience of disease. The Black Death thus served as both a destructive force and a catalyst for change. It exposed the limits of medieval medicine and spurred a quest for deeper understanding. While true germ theory was centuries away, the plague planted the seeds of skepticism toward dogma and emphasized observation and experience. This transformation would blossom in the Renaissance, with figures like Andreas Vesalius revolutionizing anatomy, and later the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, building upon foundation laid in the aftermath of the plague. In confronting the Black Death, Europe began a painful but vital journey from superstition to science, from helplessness to inquiry. The lessons learned amid death and despair shaped the trajectory of medicine and science for centuries to come. The Black Death did not simply end with the last victim's breath. Its tremors rippled through the centuries, reshaping Europe's social, political, religious, and cultural landscape in ways both immediate and enduring. By the time the plague's most devastating waves had passed, the continent was a very different place, a land marked by loss, but also by transformation, resilience, and the fragile beginnings of modernity. The immediate aftermath was a Europe devastated in body and spirit. Whole villages were abandoned, fields lay fallow, and entire generations were lost. Families mourned children, parents, and elders. Survivors bore scars, both visible and unseen. The population, having shrunk by an estimated 30 to 50%, took generations to recover. Yet from this devastation arose profound social change. The feudal system, which had dominated medieval life for centuries, weakened under the pressure of demographic collapse. Lords found their power diminished as peasants, once bound to the land by tradition and law, began to assert newfound rights. Labor shortages gave common folk leverage to demand wages, better conditions, and mobility. The old certainties crumbled. In England, the rigidity of serfdom eroded, setting the stage for more fluid social structures. The rising middle classes of merchants, artisans, and professionals gained influence. Towns expanded, marketplaces thrived, and trade routes pulsed once again with goods and ideas. The economic shifts set Europe on a path toward capitalism and global exploration. Religiously, the Black Death exposed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Church. While faith endured, many questioned its authority, especially as rival popes divided the Church during the Great Schism. Calls for reform echoed louder, sowing seeds that would eventually lead to movements like the Protestant Reformation. Spiritually, the pandemic deepened human awareness of mortality. Art, literature, and ritual embraced themes of death and redemption, inviting reflection on life's brevity and the hope for salvation. The dance of death motif, the surge in memento mori art, and the solemn ceremonies around death became cultural touchstones. Medical knowledge, painfully acquired in plague's shadow, propelled Europe toward modern science. Public health measures such as quarantines and isolation, though primitive, revealed an emerging understanding of contagion. Universities and hospitals laid foundations that would grow into scientific inquiry and healthcare systems. Politically, the upheaval fomented unrest, but also catalyzed new forms of governance. The Peasants' Revolt in England, the Jacquerie in France, and other uprisings revealed tensions, but also the emergence of more participatory political consciousness. Monarchs learned that authority depended on negotiation with their subjects, a slow step toward more modern states. Culturally, the Black Death's imprint endured in stories passed down, in architecture of cemeteries and churches, and in the collective memory of communities. The plague was not forgotten. It became part of the narrative of human struggle and survival, a grim teacher reminding generations of the fragile balance between life and death. The psychological impact reshaped societies. Survivors grappled with trauma, loss, and uncertainty. Yet amid grief, human creativity and compassion flourished. Charitable institutions, hospitals, and religious foundations expanded, often as acts of devotion and social care. In the long sweep of history, the Black Death stands as a profound turning point. It was a rupture that ended an era and birthed another. A medieval world fading and the early modern world emerging from its ashes. The plague's legacy is a testament to human endurance, the capacity to confront catastrophe, to learn, and to rebuild. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, humanity finds ways to hope, to adapt, and to transform. Today, the echoes of the Black Death resonate in public health practices, social structures, and cultural expressions. Its story remains a vital part of understanding how crises reshape societies and how resilience can emerge from tragedy. As Europe stepped forward from the shadow of the plague, it did so changed forever, its history indelibly marked by the dance with death, but illuminated by the stubborn light of life.